She can barely afford rent. And she thinks she deserves custody? Daniel said it just loud enough for the people behind him to hear. And a few of them did laugh, not loudly, not boldly, but enough for the sound to settle into the room like something unpleasant that no one wanted to acknowledge. And Evelyn Carter stood there without moving, her hands steady around a thin stack of documents, her expression unchanged, her eyes not even shifting in his direction, as if the words had landed somewhere far away from her, as if they belonged to someone else. Entirely, and that was the first thing people misunderstood about her that morning. They thought silence meant weakness. They thought stillness meant surrender, but Evelyn had learned a long time ago that silence was not the absence of power, it was the control of it. The courtroom felt colder than it should have, the air conditioning humming softly above polished wood and worn carpet, the kind of room where decisions were made slowly but consequences lasted for years. Daniel adjusted his cufflinks like he had already won, like this was just another meeting, another negotiation, another deal he could close with confidence and a well-practiced smile. His attorney, Robert Hayes, sat beside him with the relaxed posture of a man who had done this many times before, a man who knew how to shape a narrative and present it cleanly, convincingly, efficiently. Evelyn stood alone at her table, no attorney, no assistant, no stack of binders, just a folder and a calm that didn't seem to belong in a place like this. The judge glanced over his glasses, scanning the room briefly before settling his attention forward. And when he called the case, Daniel leaned back slightly, as if giving himself more space, more room to breathe in a situation he believed he controlled. Evelyn stepped forward when her name was called, not quickly, not hesitantly, just deliberately, every movement measured, every step quiet, the faint sound of her shoes against the floor almost lost beneath the shuffle of papers and distant coughs. Daniel didn't look at her at first. He didn't need to in his mind, she was already behind him, already outmatched, already outmaneuvered, because that's how he had always seen her, not as an opponent, not as someone capable of resistance, but as someone who had once been useful and was now simply in the way. And that assumption had carried him here, into this room, into this moment, into what he believed was the final step of taking control of everything that mattered, including their child. Evelyn placed her folder down gently, her fingers lingering on the edge for just a second longer than necessary, not out of hesitation but out of precision, like she was aligning something only she could see. The judge asked a simple question about representation, routine, procedural, expected, and before anyone else could speak, before Hayes could even glance in her direction, Evelyn answered in a voice that was quiet but clear. "No, Your Honor, she will be representing herself today." There was a pause, a small ripple through the room, a shift in attention. Daniel smiled then, just slightly. The kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes, the kind that comes from certainty, from believing that the outcome has already been decided. And in that moment, in that exact moment, he made the mistake that would cost him everything, because he thought this was about custody. He thought this was about money. He thought this was about winning. And he didn't realize yet that Evelyn Carter had already seen the entire board, and she was not here to argue, she was here to reveal. Daniel leaned slightly toward his attorney as if the rest of the room no longer mattered, his voice lower now but still carrying enough confidence to be noticed, and Robert Hayes gave a small nod before standing, smoothing the front of his tailored suit with practiced ease, the kind of movement that signaled control, preparation, and a quiet promise of victory. He began speaking in a tone that was calm and structured, laying out facts in a sequence that sounded reasonable, almost inevitable, emphasizing stability, income, environment, everything that painted Daniel as the obvious choice, the better choice, the responsible choice. He spoke about square footage in school districts, about consistent income streams and structured routines, about the importance of a child growing up in a home that could provide every opportunity, and each word seemed to settle neatly into place, building a narrative that felt difficult to challenge. Evelyn did not interrupt, she did not shift her weight, she did not even glance at the judge while Hayes spoke. She simply stood there, listening, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the table as if she had all the time in the world, which made a few people in the room uneasy without quite understanding why. Daniel kept his gaze forward, occasionally adjusting his watch, occasionally leaning back in his chair. His expression relaxed, almost bored, like a man waiting for something predictable to finish, and when Hayes mentioned Evelyn's financial situation, describing it carefully but deliberately as limited, there was another small ripple of reaction in the gallery, not loud, not overt, just enough to reinforce the imbalance, just enough to suggest that the outcome was already leaning in one direction, Evelyn's name was spoken several times in that explanation, but she did not react to it, not even a flicker, as if the version of her being described did not belong to her at all, as if she was listening to a story about someone else. And that was the second thing people misunderstood. They thought she was being overwhelmed, they thought she had nothing to say, they thought silence meant she had no defense. But silence can also mean patience, and patience, when used correctly, becomes something else entirely. Hayes concluded his initial argument by reinforcing one simple idea: that Daniel Carter could provide a better life, a more secure life, a more stable future, and that custody should reflect what was best for the child, not sentiment, not emotion, not history. The judge nodded slightly, making a note, then looked toward Evelyn, giving her the space to respond. The room shifted again. A subtle tightening, a quiet anticipation. Because this was the moment where most people would try to defend themselves, would try to explain, would try to appeal to sympathy. But Evelyn did not do any of that. She reached down slowly, opened her folder, and took out a single sheet of paper, just one, which in itself felt out of place against the thick stacks presented by the opposing side. She held it lightly between her fingers, glanced at it for less than a second, then looked up, not at Daniel, not at the attorney, but directly at the judge, her voice even, controlled, almost soft, but clear enough to carry across the room without effort. "He did not request custody until March 3rd of this year," she said, and there was a slight pause, not dramatic, not forced, just enough for the date to settle. Hayes shifted slightly, as if adjusting his stance. Daniel's expression did not change, but his eyes flickered for just a fraction of a second, the kind of movement most people would miss. Evelyn continued without raising her voice, "That is also the date the trust became accessible." Another pause, shorter this time but heavier. The word trust seemed to land differently. It did not fit neatly into the narrative that had just been presented. It did not align with stability or school districts or square footage. It introduced something else, something less comfortable, something that did not sound like parenting at all. A faint crease appeared between Hayes's brows as he glanced at his notes, then at Daniel, then back toward Evelyn, recalculating, adjusting. Daniel shifted in his seat now, not dramatically, just enough to break the stillness he had maintained earlier. And for the first time since the hearing began, he looked directly at Evelyn, not with confidence, not with certainty, but with a small emerging question that he had not prepared for, because until that moment, he believed he understood the game. He believed he knew the rules, and more importantly, he believed he knew her. But Evelyn had not come to explain herself, she had not come to defend her past, she had come to point at something specific, something documented, something timed. And she had done it with a single sentence, without emotion, without accusation, without raising her voice. And that was the moment the room began to change, not visibly, not all at once, but subtly, like a shift in pressure, like the air itself had decided to pay closer attention, and Daniel did not realize it yet. But the ground beneath him had already started to move. The word trust did not fade the way most words do in a courtroom. It stayed there, suspended, heavier than it should have been, and Judge Whitman did not move immediately. He did not speak. He simply looked down at the paper in front of him again, slower this time, as if something small had just become significant. Robert Hayes cleared his throat softly and stepped forward, adjusting his tone without fully changing it, attempting to smooth over the shift. "Your Honor, I am not sure what relevance that has to the matter of custody," he said, measured, careful, but there was a slight tightness now, something that had not been there before. Evelyn did not respond to him. She did not even acknowledge his question. She simply placed the single sheet she had been holding onto the table and slid it forward a few inches, not toward Hayes, not toward Daniel, but toward the judge, her movement precise, unhurried, as if she had rehearsed it without ever needing to. Daniel leaned forward slightly, just enough to see the paper from where he sat, but not enough to break the image of control he had been maintaining. His jaw tightened for a fraction of a second, then relaxed again. He told himself it was nothing, it had to be nothing, because everything that mattered had already been handled. The filings were complete, the arguments were solid, the outcome was clear, and yet something about the way Evelyn stood there, something about the absence of urgency in her voice, unsettled him in a way he could not immediately explain. Judge Whitman picked up the paper, his eyes scanning the top line first, then moving down more slowly, and the silence that followed was not empty, it was dense, filled with the quiet awareness of people who knew something had just shifted but did not yet understand how far it would go. Hayes took a small step closer, trying to read the judge's expression, trying to anticipate the direction this might take. But the judge's face remained neutral. Controlled, the kind of neutrality that gives nothing away until it is ready. Evelyn spoke again, still calm, still steady. The trust was established 8 years ago, she said, her tone unchanged. But it remained inactive until March 3rd. She did not look at Daniel, she did not look at Hayes, she kept her focus exactly where it needed to be. And that control began to change the way the room saw her, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough for the assumptions to start loosening. Daniel shifted again, this time more noticeably, his hand moving to rest on the table, fingers tapping. Once before going still, a small movement, but one that did not match the confidence he had shown earlier. Hayes turned slightly toward him, a quick glance, a silent question, but Daniel did not answer it, because he was already trying to understand something he had not expected to come up, something he had not planned for, something he thought had been handled. Evelyn continued. Access to those funds requires legal guardianship, she said, each word placed carefully, each sentence building on the last without raising her voice, without adding emotion, just fact after fact, the kind that does not argue, the kind that does not need to. The judge's eyes lifted from the document and settled on Daniel for the first time with a new kind of attention, not accusatory, not yet, but sharper, more focused, and that was when the discomfort in the room became visible, not loud, not disruptive, just present, like a change in temperature that everyone could feel but no one wanted to acknowledge. Hayes straightened his posture, attempting to regain ground. Your Honor, my client is fully capable of providing for his child regardless of any external accounts, he said. But the sentence did not land the way his earlier ones had. It did not carry the same weight, because now there was a question underneath everything, a question that had not been there before. Evelyn did not argue that point, she did not contradict him, she simply let the statement exist, and in doing so made it feel incomplete. Judge Whitman set the paper down slowly, his fingers resting on it for a moment longer than necessary. Then he looked directly at Hayes, then at Daniel, and when he spoke, his voice was still calm, still controlled, but there was something else in it now, something that had not been there at the start of the hearing. Counsel, he said, I would like clarification on why this request for custody was filed within hours of the trust activation. The question hung in the air, simple, direct, impossible to ignore, and Daniel felt it then, not panic, not yet, but the first real crack in certainty, the first moment where the outcome no longer felt guaranteed, because this was no longer just about who could provide a better home, this was about why he had asked for custody at all. And for the first time since the hearing began, Daniel Carter did not have an immediate answer. The question did not echo loudly, but it lingered in a way that made every second feel longer, and Robert Hayes did not answer immediately, which in itself was unusual, because he was the kind of attorney who always had something ready, always had a response shaped before the question was fully asked. But now he paused, just briefly, just enough for the delay to be noticed, and that was all it took for the room to shift again. Daniel felt it more than he saw it, a subtle change in posture from the people behind him, a quiet attention that no longer leaned in his favor. Hayes finally stepped forward, his voice still controlled, still professional, but missing the smooth certainty it carried before. Your Honor, my client's decision was based on long-term considerations for the child's welfare, he said, carefully choosing each word, but the explanation sounded broader now, less precise, like something trying to cover more ground than it needed to. Judge Whitman did not interrupt, he simply watched, and that silence required more from Hayes than any objection would have, forcing him to continue, forcing him to fill the space with something that could hold. The timing is coincidental, Hayes added, and that single word coincidental seemed to land poorly, not because it was incorrect on its own, but because it sounded incomplete, because it asked the court to accept a connection without examining it. Evelyn remained still, her hands resting lightly against the table, her gaze steady, not challenging, not emotional, just present, and that presence began to carry weight. Daniel turned slightly toward Hayes now, his jaw tightening again, a quiet signal that he expected this to be handled, expected it to be resolved quickly. But Hayes did not look at him this time. His focus remained forward on the judge, on the document, on the narrowing space where the argument needed to hold. Coincidental, Judge Whitman repeated, not as a challenge, not yet, but as if testing the word itself, measuring its strength. Then he leaned back slightly, folding his hands together, and when he spoke again, his tone remained calm, but there was a clarity in it now that cut through the room more cleanly than anything that had been said so far. This court does not operate on coincidence, counsel, he said, and the sentence was simple, but it shifted the ground in a way that no raised voice could have. Hayes adjusted his stance again, A subtle movement, almost imperceptible, but it revealed something, not panic but recalculation. Daniel felt his certainty slipping now, not completely, not all at once, but enough to notice, enough to create a quiet pressure in his chest that had not been there before. Evelyn reached into her folder again, not quickly, not dramatically, just another deliberate motion, and she placed a second document on the table, this one thicker, its edges slightly worn, as if it had been handled more than once. She did not slide it forward immediately, she let it rest there for a moment, then looked up at the judge. "There is more," she said, her voice unchanged, and that sentence carried more weight than it should have, because it was not emotional, it was not defensive, it was simply factual, and facts, when introduced at the right moment, tend to change everything. Hayes turned his head slightly toward the document, his expression tightening just enough to suggest that whatever was coming next had not been part of his preparation. Daniel followed his gaze, and for the first time he felt something sharper than doubt, something closer to concern, because until now he believed this was a matter of presentation, of argument, of who could speak better, who could frame the story more effectively. But Evelyn was not framing anything, she was revealing it piece by piece, and he had no idea how much she had. Judge Whitman gestured lightly toward the document, giving permission without needing to say the words, and Evelyn slid it forward. The sound of paper against polished wood, quiet but distinct. The judge picked it up, flipping the first page slowly, then the second, his eyes narrowing slightly as he read. Not in confusion but in focus, the kind of focus that comes when something aligns too clearly to ignore. Hayes took a half step forward, his composure still intact but strained at the edges. "Your Honor, I would ask for a moment to review that document," he said, and the request itself was not unusual, but the timing of it was, it came too late, after the document had already been seen, after the first impression had already formed. The judge did not hand it over immediately, instead, he continued reading, one more page, then another, and the silence that followed was no longer neutral, it was heavy, deliberate, filled with the quiet understanding that whatever was written there was not helping Daniel's position. Evelyn did not speak again, she did not need to, she simply stood there, steady, controlled, allowing the information to do exactly what it was meant to do. And Daniel sat very still now. His earlier confidence replaced by something quieter, something more cautious, because for the first time since he filed for custody, he was no longer certain that he was the one in control of what happened next. Judge Whitman did not look up immediately after turning the last page, and that hesitation carried more weight than any spoken reaction, his fingers resting along the edge of the document as if confirming something that no longer needed confirmation. Robert Hayes stood still now, no longer adjusting his stance, no longer shifting his tone, simply waiting, because there was nothing else to do until the judge spoke, and Daniel sat back slightly, not in confidence this time, but in restraint, his shoulders held a little tighter, his jaw set just enough to suggest that whatever was written in that document had reached him without being read aloud. Evelyn remained exactly where she had been, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, her attention steady. She did not watch Daniel, she did not watch Hayes, she watched the judge, because that was the only place that mattered now. And when Judge Whitman finally lifted his gaze, it was not toward Evelyn, it was toward Daniel, direct, measured, deliberate. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice even but unmistakably focused, "this document indicates that you submitted an application for limited financial guardianship prior to filing for custody." The room shifted again, more noticeably this time, not in noise but in attention, a quiet awareness moving through the space like a ripple that could not be contained. Daniel did not answer immediately, and that silence, brief as it was, did more damage than any denial could have. Hayes stepped forward instinctively, attempting to regain control of the moment. "Your Honor, that filing was exploratory in nature," he said, but the explanation came too quickly, too prepared, and it did not match the weight of what had just been revealed. The judge did not interrupt him, but he did not acknowledge the explanation either. His attention remained on Daniel, waiting, allowing the question to settle where it needed to, forcing the response to come from the person it belonged to. Daniel cleared his throat slightly, his voice controlled but lower now, less certain. "It was a precaution," he said, and even as the words left him, they sounded incomplete, because a precaution suggests anticipation, and anticipation suggests intent, and intent is difficult to separate from action once it has been documented. Evelyn did not react to his answer. She did not need to, the document had already done what it was meant to do. It had drawn a line between timing and purpose, and that line was becoming clearer with every second. Judge Whitman glanced back down at the pages briefly, then returned his attention to Daniel. "You filed for financial control before you filed for custody," he said, not as a question but as a statement, and the distinction mattered because statements in a courtroom are not easily undone. Hayes shifted again, attempting to step back into the space. "Your Honor, my client was advised to consider all legal avenues regarding the child's future," he said, but the phrasing felt broader now, less precise, like something trying to dilute what had already been made specific. The judge leaned back slightly, his expression still composed, but there was no longer any ambiguity in his focus. "And yet the timing aligns exactly with the activation of the trust," he said, and this time the word trust did not feel abstract, it felt defined, connected, anchored to something real, something measurable, something that could not be explained away with generalities. Daniel's hand tightened slightly against the table, his fingers pressing into the surface for just a moment before relaxing again. A small movement, but enough to reveal that the control he had shown earlier was no longer complete. Evelyn reached into her folder one more time. Not hurried, not dramatic, just consistent. And she placed a final sheet beside the others, her voice steady as she spoke. "The trust requires joint oversight unless one guardian is legally removed," she said, and that sentence landed with precision, because it did not accuse, it clarified, it did not suggest, it explained, and in that explanation something else became visible, something that had been hidden beneath the arguments about stability and income and environment, something that reframed the entire request for custody. The room was quieter now, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that needed to be understood was beginning to settle into place. Hayes did not speak this time. He did not attempt to redirect, because there was no clear path to do so without addressing what had already been revealed. Daniel looked forward, his expression controlled but no longer confident, his earlier certainty replaced by a careful stillness, as if any movement might make things worse. Judge Whitman closed the document slowly, placing it on the bench in front of him with deliberate care. And when he spoke again, his voice carried the same calm authority as before, but now it held something else, something firmer, something that did not invite explanation. "This court is not concerned with who can present the better argument," he said. "It is concerned with intent," and that word intent settled into the room with a finality that changed everything, because intent cannot be adjusted once it has been shown. It cannot be reframed once it has been documented, and Daniel Carter realized, not all at once but clearly enough, that the case he thought he was winning had already begun to turn against him. The word intent did not fade after it was spoken, it settled into the room like something final, something that could not be reshaped once it had been understood, and Daniel felt it more than he heard it, a quiet shift that pressed against the certainty he had walked in with. Robert Hayes adjusted his posture again. But this time the movement lacked direction. It was no longer about control, it was about response, about finding something, anything, that could redirect what had already begun to form. "Your Honor, intent can be interpreted in multiple ways," he said, carefully, but the sentence felt weaker than the ones he had used before, because it did not deny, it did not clarify, it only suggested uncertainty, and uncertainty was not something that helped his position now. Judge Whitman did not respond immediately, his attention moving briefly back to the documents before returning to Daniel, not rushed, not aggressive, just steady. "Then let us remove interpretation," he said, his tone even, "and focus on sequence." And that distinction mattered because sequence does not rely on opinion, it relies on order, on timing, on actions that have already been recorded. Evelyn remained still, her presence unchanged, but now it carried something different, not just calm but control, not over the room, but over the pace of what was unfolding. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his hands resting flat against the table now, no longer tapping, no longer moving, just placed there as if holding himself in place. "I was planning ahead," he said, and the explanation came out quieter than he intended, less certain than he had practiced, because it no longer fit cleanly against the evidence that had already been placed in front of the court. Evelyn did not react to his words, she did not challenge them. She allowed them to exist exactly as they were, and in doing so made them feel incomplete, because planning ahead for what and for whom were questions that no one needed to ask out loud anymore. Judge Whitman nodded once, slowly, not in agreement but in acknowledgement, then he turned a page back in the document, revisiting a section with deliberate care. "Your filing requests sole decision-making authority in the event of financial disbursement, he said, reading directly from the text, and that sentence carried more weight than any argument that had been made so far, because it was not interpretation, it was written, it was signed, it was submitted. Hayes stepped forward again, this time more carefully, aware that every word now mattered more than before. That clause is standard in certain financial protections, he said, but the explanation sounded narrower, more defensive, and it did not address the timing, it did not address the sequence, it only attempted to soften the implication. Daniel exhaled slowly, the first visible sign that the pressure had reached him, his shoulders lowering just slightly, his posture no longer relaxed but not rigid either, something in between, something uncertain. Evelyn reached for her folder once more, but this time she did not remove another document, she simply closed it, her fingers resting on the cover. For a brief moment before lifting her hand away, a small action, but it signaled something important. She had nothing else to add because she did not need to. Everything that mattered was already in front of the court. Judge Whitman observed that movement, then returned his attention to Daniel, his expression unchanged, but his focus sharper now, more defined. "Mr. Carter," he said, "when did you last request additional parenting time prior to this filing?" And the question cut through the room in a different way, not by introducing something new, but by connecting what had already been shown to what had not been done. Daniel hesitated just for a second, but that second was enough for the absence of an answer to become visible, enough for the pattern to become clearer. "I was traveling," he said finally, and the explanation sounded thin even to him, because it did not align with the urgency he had claimed. It did not match the sudden interest in custody that had appeared at the exact moment the trust became accessible. Evelyn did not look at him, she did not need to, the contrast was already there, already understood. Judge Whitman nodded again, slower this time, then placed both hands on the bench, his fingers resting evenly against the surface. "This court evaluates consistency," he said, "not sudden interest," and the sentence settled into the room with quiet authority because it reframed everything. It shifted the focus from what Daniel said he wanted to what he had actually done. And that difference is difficult to overcome once it has been made clear. Hayes did not speak, not this time, because there was no immediate path to redirect what had just been established. Daniel sat back slightly, his earlier confidence gone now, replaced by a careful stillness that looked more like calculation than control, and Evelyn remained exactly as she had been from the beginning, calm, quiet, composed, because she had never needed to fight for the moment, she had only needed to wait for it, and now that it had arrived, there was nothing left for her to prove, only something for the court to recognize. The room did not return to its earlier rhythm after that. It held a different kind of stillness now, one that was not waiting for argument but for recognition, and Daniel could feel it in the way no one shifted behind him anymore, in the way even the smallest sound seemed to pause before happening. Robert Hayes looked down at his notes, flipping a page that no longer seemed useful, his movements slower now, more deliberate, as if searching for something that had already passed. Judge Whitman remained composed, his posture unchanged, but his attention no longer divided. It was fixed, precise, directed entirely at the sequence that had been laid out in front of him. Evelyn stood with the same quiet control she had held from the beginning, but now it was understood differently, no longer mistaken for passivity, no longer dismissed as absence. It had become something else entirely, something intentional. Daniel adjusted his seat slightly, the leather creaking beneath him, a small sound that seemed louder than it should have been. He folded his hands together, then unfolded them again, as if deciding what position to hold, what version of himself to present next. "I have always provided," he said finally, his voice steady but lacking the certainty it carried earlier, and the statement sounded familiar, almost rehearsed, the kind of line that works in most situations, the kind that suggests responsibility without needing detail. Evelyn did not respond, she did not challenge the statement, she let it exist on its own, and without support it began to feel incomplete. Judge Whitman nodded once, acknowledging the words without affirming them, then leaned forward slightly, bringing his hands together on the bench. "Providing is not the same as participating," he said, and the distinction settled into the room with quiet precision, because it reframed everything Daniel had been relying on. It shifted the focus from what he had done financially to what he had not done consistently. Hayes stepped forward again, but this time more cautiously, aware that each sentence now needed to be exact. "Your Honor, my client's work required travel, but that does not diminish his commitment," he said, and the explanation sounded reasonable on its surface, but it no longer carried the weight it needed because the timing had already been exposed, the sequence had already been questioned. Evelyn reached for the edge of the table, her fingers resting lightly against it, then lifted her gaze just slightly, not toward Daniel but toward the judge, her voice calm, measured, almost quiet. "He missed the last 3 school conferences," she said, and the sentence was simple, factual, unembellished. It did not accuse, it did not judge, it only stated, and in doing so, it added another piece to the pattern that had already begun to form. Daniel's expression tightened briefly, then settled again. He did not respond immediately because there was no clean way to respond, not without explaining something he had not prepared to explain. Judge Whitman made a small note, then looked back up. "And prior to March 3rd, he said, "when was the last time you requested additional time with your child?" The question returned, not as repetition but as reinforcement. Daniel inhaled slowly, his gaze shifting for just a moment before returning forward. "I believed the arrangement we had was working," he said, and the answer sounded controlled, but it did not align with the urgency he had shown in filing for custody. It did not match the sudden shift that had been documented. Evelyn did not move, she did not react, but the absence of reaction itself carried meaning, because she did not need to argue against his words. They were already standing alone, unsupported by action. Hayes opened his mouth slightly as if to add something, then stopped, closing it again, recognizing that anything added now would need to address more than it could explain. Judge Whitman leaned back again, his gaze steady, his tone unchanged. "The court is not evaluating potential," he said. "It is evaluating pattern." And that word, pattern, settled deeper than the others, because it connected everything, the timing, the filings, the absence, the sudden request. It tied them together into something that could not be easily separated. Daniel felt it then, clearly, the shift from argument to conclusion beginning to form. Not fully stated yet, but already understood. His earlier confidence had not just weakened, it had been replaced by something quieter, something more cautious, something that recognized the direction this was moving. Evelyn lowered her gaze slightly, not in submission, not in hesitation, but in completion, as if she had already done what she came to do, as if everything that needed to be seen had been placed where it needed to be, and now there was nothing left to add, because the outcome was no longer about who could speak louder or argue better. It was about what had already been shown, and Daniel Carter was beginning to understand that the story he believed he controlled had already been rewritten without him. By the time the word pattern settled into the silence, the courtroom no longer felt like a place where arguments were being made. It felt like a place where something had already been decided and was simply waiting to be spoken aloud. Daniel could feel the weight of it pressing in from all sides, not through noise, but through the absence of it, through the way no one shifted in their seats anymore, through the way even his own breathing seemed louder than it should have been. Robert Hayes remained still beside him, his earlier rhythm gone, his notes no longer guiding him, because there was nothing left to rearrange, nothing left to present that had not already been overshadowed by what Evelyn had introduced. Judge Whitman looked down once more at the documents, not to search, not to reconsider, but to confirm, his fingers resting lightly against the pages as if marking the sequence in his mind. Then he lifted his gaze again, steady and deliberate. "Mr. Carter," he said, his tone unchanged but carrying a finality that had not been there before. "This court has reviewed your filings, your requests, and the timing associated with them." He paused, not for effect, but because the pause itself was part of the structure, part of the way decisions are built step by step, and Daniel felt that pause more sharply than any words, because it left no space to interrupt, no space to redirect. "And what has been presented suggests a pattern of interest that aligns with financial access rather than consistent parental involvement." The sentence was precise, measured, and it did not raise its voice, but it landed with a weight that made response unnecessary. Daniel's hand shifted slightly on the table, his fingers curling inward for just a moment before relaxing again. A small movement, but enough to show that the control he once held had fully slipped. Hayes glanced toward him, then back at the judge, but did not speak, because there was nothing left that could be said without confronting what had already been established. Evelyn stood quietly, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, not relieved, not triumphant, just steady, as if she had expected this exact moment from the beginning. Judge Whitman continued, his voice consistent. "Custody decisions are based on the best interests of the child, not on financial positioning," he said, and the distinction was no longer theoretical, It had been defined through the sequence, through the documents, through the absence of consistent involvement that had been revealed piece by piece. Daniel exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering slightly, not in defeat, but in recognition, the kind that comes when a situation moves beyond control. And into consequence, Evelyn did not look at him, she did not need to, because the shift was already visible to everyone in the room. The narrative he had relied on had not just weakened, it had collapsed under the weight of its own timing. The judge reached for a pen, making a brief notation before setting it down again, his attention returning forward. Based on the evidence presented, the court does not find sufficient basis to alter the current custodial arrangement in favor of the petitioner, he said, and the sentence was delivered without emphasis, without pause, because it did not need either. It was clear, complete, and final in its direction. Daniel's gaze dropped for just a second, then lifted again. But there was nothing left to hold on to, no argument left to make that had not already been addressed. Hayes nodded once, a small acknowledgement, the kind attorneys give when they understand that a path has closed. Evelyn remained still, her hands resting lightly against the table, her breathing even, her presence unchanged, but now fully understood, because what had once been mistaken for silence was now recognized as control. Judge Whitman looked between them one final time, his expression composed, his tone steady. This court also notes the importance of continued stability for the child, including maintaining established routines and primary residence. He added, reinforcing the decision not as a reaction, but as a continuation of what had already been working. Daniel leaned back slightly, the leather chair shifting beneath him, his posture no longer structured, no longer presenting, just present, and in that moment the difference between intention and outcome became unmistakable. Evelyn reached for her folder, closing it gently, not hurried, not dramatic, just a quiet conclusion to something she had prepared long before stepping into the room. She did not rush to leave, she did not look around, she simply stood there for a second longer, allowing the moment to settle completely, because this was never about speaking louder or reacting faster, it was about understanding the timing, the sequence, the truth behind the request, and letting it unfold exactly as it needed to. And as the courtroom remained still for just a moment longer, it became clear to everyone present that what had happened there was not a sudden victory. It was the result of something far more controlled, far more deliberate, something Daniel Carter had never truly seen until it was already too late. The decision did not come with a raised voice or a dramatic pause. It came the way most real consequences do, quiet, steady, and impossible to undo once spoken. And for a moment after the judge finished, no one moved, not because they did not understand, but because they understood completely. Daniel remained seated, his hands resting on the table, no longer adjusting, no longer presenting, just still, as if movement itself had become unnecessary. Robert Hayes gathered his papers slowly, not rushing, not signaling defeat, but acknowledging the finality in the only way he could, through routine, through the quiet act of closing a folder that would not be opened again in the same way. Evelyn stood where she had been, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, not relieved, not satisfied, just steady, because what had just happened was not unexpected to her. It was the result of something she had already seen coming long before the hearing began. Judge Whitman made one last notation, then set his pen down, his attention moving away from the case as the structure of the room began to shift back into motion. Chairs moved slightly, papers were gathered. The quiet hum of the courtroom returned, but it felt different now, less tense, less uncertain, because the question that had been hanging in the air was no longer unanswered. Daniel finally stood slowly, the movement deliberate, controlled, but lacking the confidence it once carried. He adjusted his jacket out of habit, smoothing the front as if that small action could restore something that had already been lost. He glanced toward Hayes, who gave a brief nod, not of reassurance but of closure, the kind that signals there is nothing more to say, nothing more to add. Evelyn reached for her folder, holding it lightly at her side, then turned slightly toward the aisle, her steps measured as she began to walk, not hurried, not hesitant, just forward. And for a brief second Daniel looked at her, really looked at her, not as someone he had already defined, not as someone he had already dismissed, but as someone he had failed to understand, because everything he believed about her had been built on what she chose not to show, and what she chose not to show had been the only thing that mattered. She did not look back, she did not pause, she did not acknowledge the moment in any outward way, because for her, the moment had already passed long before they stepped into the courtroom. Daniel followed a few steps behind, slower, his gaze shifting briefly to the door, then back to the space they were leaving. as if trying to place where exactly things had changed, where exactly the control had slipped, but there was no single moment, no single line. It had been a sequence, a pattern, something that had unfolded piece by piece until there was nothing left to question. Outside the courtroom, the hallway felt brighter, the overhead lights reflecting off polished floors, the distant sound of voices returning to normal volume, the world continuing in a way that did not pause for individual outcomes. Evelyn walked forward without stopping, her pace even, her focus clear, as if she already knew where she was going next. Daniel slowed near the doorway, his hand brushing lightly against the frame for just a second before dropping again. A small, unconscious gesture, the kind that appears when certainty disappears. Hayes spoke quietly to him, something brief, something practical, but Daniel only nodded, because the details no longer mattered the way they had before. Evelyn reached the end of the hallway and paused, not because she needed to, but because the moment allowed it. She adjusted the folder in her hand, her fingers resting against its edge for a brief second, then continued forward, and in that simple motion there was something final, not in the sense of ending everything, but in the sense of closing what had needed to be closed. Daniel remained where he was for a moment longer, watching the space she had just moved through, not calling out, not stepping forward, just standing there with the quiet realization that what he thought was an opportunity had become something else entirely, something that had revealed more than it had gained, because he had believed this was about control, about positioning, about securing something that could be managed. But what he had exposed instead was intent, and intent, once seen, does not disappear, it remains, shaping how everything is understood moving forward. Evelyn did not look back, not once, because she did not need confirmation, she did not need acknowledgement, she had never needed either. And as she walked out into the light beyond the hallway, the quiet certainty she carried with her was not loud, not visible in any dramatic way, but it was complete. And Daniel Carter, standing just inside the doorway, finally understood something that had been true long before he ever filed that request. He had never been in control of this story, he had only been part of it, and by the time he realized that, it was already over.